spirit speaking, truth seeking, heart reaching, knowledge leaking, seeds sowing, harvest reaping, man of meager means. I have yet to leave, I'm still breathing. To quit, I have no reason. I mean, I'm asleep, but I be trying to live my dreams. I cannot even act if it's all easy. Either you gon' do it or you don't really. It ain't no in between. Baby, you can ask the sun, it's an everyday thing. Consistency in your routine is how you bring reality. Working like a slave, that's how I made this masterpiece. Living like a god, I lay at night, I rest in peace. They remember me, but I am not Haram or beef.
Peace, 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 peace. Peace, love, and light. Peace, love, and light, Noble. Happy Holy Friday. We're back again with another BBT book club reading. Happy Holy Friday to all light seekers, all nobles, all empresses, all those who value history, heritage, wisdom, and understanding. I'm your host, Noble Moso L of the Burning Bush Tabernacle, Science Temple and School. And tonight, as you can see on the screen, the book and the topic that we'll be going over is The Origins of Slavery. And this book specifically is called They Were White and They Were Slaves. And it's the untold history of the enslavement of whites in early America. And this is a must-read book. You can get it from us. You can email me directly. As you can see on that bottom yellow ticker, Herbs of Mayat at herbsofmayat.com. And check out some of our other books at mypdfbooks.com and bindedbooks.com. We have a plethora of books and topics that we want people to really tap into and study. So you can really study along with us, read with us, ask questions. If anyone listening live in this live chat drops the word wisdom in the comments and your email, I'll gift you a copy of this book, because this information needs to be spread. This is the missing pages of world history, as we say. And sadly, there have been a lot of missing pages in history. Excuse me, I'm trying to get my screen right. But with no further ado, just really just talking about enslavement around the world, breaking down the etymology of the word Slav or slave, which comes from Slav, which were people of Eastern Europe. Slavic people, Czechoslovakia. These places were around and have been around since the ancient days, medieval times. And just a disclaimer, I'm not sharing this topic to say one person's enslavement was worse than another or more horrific. I'm here simply just to share the information that we weren't taught in school, in grade school, in movies. We find sprinkles of it, but you really have to look with a keen eye to really embrace and see the half-truths that we're told. All people of this earth were enslaved at one point. Many nations were in slavery and prisoners of war. The world was a lot different than the world we live in today. And myself as an educator and a historian, I'm just here to shed light on those darker times, those times that, some of our ancestors were in power. Some brothers of Islam were the Barbary experience that, Europeans at first, all they had was their children as a commodity. They didn't, before they had gold and diamonds and natural resources per se. The ultimate resource was the human being, the human body, and the labor that person could give. And so I'm just going to read through this a little bit. I welcome all to listen and follow along. Again, this book is called They Were White and They Were Slaves: The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. This book was written by, excuse me. Sorry. This book was written by Hoffman, excuse me. This book was written by Michael A. Hoffman. Excuse me. There were two sorts. First, such as were brought over by masters of ships to be sold as servants. Such as we call them, my dear, says she, but they are more properly called slaves. That's Daniel Defoe, Moll Flanders. This is a history of white people that has never been told in any coherent form, largely because most modern historians have, for reasons or politics or psychology, refused to recognize white slaves in early America as just that. This is a history of white people that has never been told in any coherent form. Today, not a tear is shed for the sufferings of millions of our own enslaved forefathers. 200 years of white slavery in America have been almost completely obliterated from the collective memory of the American people. Who wants to be reminded that half, perhaps as many as thirds, of the original American colonists came here not of their own free will, but kidnapped, shanghaied, impressed, duped, beguiled, and yes, in chains? We tend to gloss over it. We prefer to forget the whole sorry chapter. And that was written by Elaine Kendall in the LA Times, September 1st, 1985. A correct understanding of the authentic history of the enslavement of whites in America could have profound consequence for the future of the races. We cannot be sure that the position of the earliest Africans differed markedly from that of the white indentured servants. The debate has considerable significance for the interpretation of race relations in American history. And that source is Eugene D. Genovese, Roll, Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made, page 31. Most of the book on white labor in early America are titled with words like white indentured servitude, white bond servant, white servants, etc. It is interesting that white people who were bound to a condition of what became in many cases permanent chattel slavery, upon death, unto death, are not referred to as slaves by establishment academics. With the massive concentration of educational and media resources on the Negro experience of slavery, the unspoken assumption has been that only blacks have been enslaved to any degree or magnitude worth of study or memorial. The historical records reveals that this is not the case. However, white people have been sold as slaves for centuries. And I would just like to add, it was always a book that I read as a child. It's called The Whipping Boy. And it always made me think, honestly, because he was a white young child who was enslaved, a slave. And I always pondered on the origins of that book. But to continue, white slavery in ancient and medieval Europe. Among the ancient Greeks, despite their tradition of democracy, the enslavement of fellow whites, even fellow Greeks, was the order of the day. Aristotle considered white slaves as things. The Romans also had no compunctions against enslaving whites, whom they termed a thing. In his agriculture writings, the 1st century BC Roman philosopher Varro labeled white slaves as nothing more than tools that happened to have voices. He used the term instrumenti vocale. Cato the Elder, discoursing on plantation management, proposed that white slaves, when old or ill, should be discarded along with worn-out farm implements. Julius Caesar enslaved as many as 1 million whites from Gaul, some who were sold to the slave dealers who followed his victorious legions. That's from a book, Slavery from Roman Times to the Early Transatlantic Trade by William D. Phillips, Jr., page 18. In AD 319, the Christian emperor of Rome, Constantine, ruled that if an owner whipped his white slave to death, he should not stand in any criminal accusation if the slave dies, and all statutes of limitations and legal interpretations are hereby set aside. The Romans enslaved thousands of the early white inhabitants of Great Britain, who are known as Angles, from which we derive the term Angle or Anglo-Saxon as a description of the English race. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory I witnessed blonde-haired, blue-eyed English boys awaiting sale in a slave market in Rome. Inquiring of their origin, the Pope was told they were Angles. And Gregory replied, "Non Angel sed Angel," not angles, but angels. When the Franks conquered the Visigoths in southern Gaul, huge numbers of whites entered the slave markets. After Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony, during which many pagan Saxons were enslaved, he set up a network of parish churches to provide for the maintenance of the priest and the church. Those living in the parish were to donate a house and land, as well as a male and female Saxon slave to the church for every 120 people in the parish. And that source is William Phillips, page 52 of his book. So this is showing that it was easy to become a slave. If you were a prisoner of war, if your people lost a battle and you could not retreat to a safe domain or safe region of land, your children, your family, your brothers, your sisters could easily become enslaved, prisoners of war. That was the world of the Greek times, of the medieval times. There was no, it was either convert, it was either become, it was either death or conversion or enslavement. So it continues into the Arabs. And as we know, the word Arab origins comes from Arap, A-R-A-P, which is originally meaning a dark-skinned person. So we know that, so quote-unquote, black people, Moors, are Arabs. These are the synonyms. These are words that we must look deeper into, so we don't look at, when we hear words like Arab and Berber and Saracen, that we don't look at those as people not of African, Moorish, Asiatic descent. Now, Arabs and the traffic in white slaves. The trade in white slaves was one of the few sources of foreign exchange for Western European powers, in a period when the East produced the goods that Europeans could not procure elsewhere. The sale of white slaves to Asia and Africa was one of the few sources of gold for European treasuries. And this is that time period I'm speaking on, where Europeans didn't have powers to control everything around the planet, as we see in the world we live in today. This was a time where Europe and European powers were not the dominant nations, per se. And it says, from the 8th to the 11th century, France was a major transfer point for white slaves to the Muslim world, with Rouen, R-O-U-E-N, being the center for the selling of Irish and Flemish slaves. At the same time that France was a transfer point for slaves to the Muslim world, Italy was occupying much the same position. The Venetians were selling slaves and timber across the Mediterranean. The slaves were usually slaves brought across the Alps. The Venetians were the earliest successful Italian sea traders, and because profits on slave trade with the Muslims were lucrative, they resisted efforts to stop them. In return for their exports of timber, iron, and white slaves, they brought in Oriental luxury products, mainly fine clothes. And that source is, again, William Phillips, page 62 to 63. The stereotype from establishment consensus history is of the Muslim slaver herding chained blacks through the desert, when in fact, for 700 years, until the fall of Muslim Spain, also known as Al-Andalusia. Those being herded were first and foremost overwhelmingly white. Before the 10th century, the Muslims generally brought Christian Europeans as slaves. By the 10th century, Slavs, Slavs, became the most numerous imported group during the late Middle Ages, until the fall of Granada. Until the fall of Granada in the late 15th century, most slaves of the Muslims were Christians from the northern kingdoms. In the vast lands of the Eastern European steppes, from the 8th to the 12th century, there was a well-developed slaving network. There was a well-developing slaving network. Excuse me. Slavs and Finns called Saqaliba, Saqaliba, slaves, indiscriminately by the Muslims, entered the Muslim world by these Caspian and Black Sea routes. The fate of the hundreds of thousands of white slaves sold to the Arabs was described in one Spanish text as most atrocious and harsh. The men were worked to death as galley slaves. And we have books as well that speak on the galley slave, the men who would row boats to death, to exhaustion. Excuse me. The women, girls, and boys were used as prostitutes. White males had their genitals mutilated in castration attempts, bloody procedures of incredible brutality, which most of the white men who were forced to submit did not survive. Judging from the high prices that white eunuchs commanded throughout the Middle Eastern slave markets. And for those who don't know, a eunuch, eunuchs, was a man who was castrated and used to watch the harem, or the group of women that some of these Muslim nobles had. They were highly valued in the ancient world. Now, escape from North Africa and the Middle East was almost impossible, as those white slaves who were caught trying to flee were punished by having their noses and ears cut off, or worse. Early Muslim texts provide insight into the extent to which the Arabs identified Europeans with slavery, classified white slaves as animals, and even produced learned racist disquisitions on the supported merits of emasculated Eastern European slaves. In his 9th century treatise on Beast, the Book of Animals, the Muslim scholar Jahiz writes, "Another change which overcomes the eunuch of two slaves of Slavic race, who are twins, one castrated and the other not. The eunuch becomes more disposed towards service, wiser, more able, and apt for various problems of manual labor. All these qualities you will find in the castrated one. On the other hand, his brother continues to have the same native torp, the same lack of natural talent, the same imbecility common to slaves. and incapacity for learning a foreign language. And that's from a book called The Slave in Medieval Europe by Charles Verdlinden, Volume 1. Whites were also enslaved in Russia, and I do not refer here to serfdom, which was a later development. Knowledge of the existence of slavery in early modern Russia is not widespread. Many people know of the existence of serfdom and confuse the two. And that's by Richard Healy, Slavery in Russia. Excuse me. Slavery in Russia. Next was the Viking slaver. In the 9th century, the Vikings sold tens of thousands of whites to Arabs of Spain. According to Michael Wood's book, In Search of the Dark Ages, an Arab traveler of the time who came to Spain remarked on the great numbers of European slaves in harems and in the militia. Excuse me. Excuse me. As I was saying, an Arab traveler of the time who came to Spain remarked on the great numbers of European slaves in harems and in the militia. The palace of the Emir of Cordoba, in particular, had many white girls. Of these unfortunate people, the Vikings were undoubtedly a major source of supply. The Arabs in Spain saw the long-term potential of this trade, and as early as the 1840s sent a diplomatic mission to Scandinavia to put it on an organized basis. The most westernly component of early medieval slave trade in Europe was the British Isles. In the 11th century, the Vikings were active slave traders in Ireland. From Ireland, the Vikings took the slaves to be sold in Muslim Spain and Scandinavia, and even to be transported into Russia. Some may have been taken as far as Constantinople and the Muslim Middle East. The Norwegian slave trader was an important enough figure to appear in the 12th century tale of Tristane. Icelandic literature also provides numerous references to raiding in Ireland as a source of slaves. Norwegian Vikings made slave raids not only against the Irish and Scots, who are often called Irish in Norse sources, but also against Norse settlers in Ireland or the Scottish Isles, or even in Norway itself. Slave trading was a major commercial activity of the Viking Age. This was stated in a book called Slavery and Society in Medieval Scandinavia by Ruth Mazo Karas. The children of the white slaves in Iceland were routinely murdered in mass. So this was a very vicious time in history. I don't want to say barbaric specifically, but it was a very vicious time. Now it's going into slavery in America, white slavery in early America. David Breon Davis's writing in the New York Review of Books in October 11th, 1990 states, as late as the 14th and 15th centuries, continuing shipments of white slaves, some of them Christians, flowed from the booming slave markets on the North Black Sea coast into Italy, Spain, Egypt, and the Mediterranean Isles. From Barbados to Virginia, colonists showed few scruples about reducing their less fortunate countrymen to a status little different from that of chattel slaves. The prevalence and suffering of white slaves, serfs, and indentured servants in the early modern period suggests that there was nothing inevitable about limiting plantation slavery to people of African origin. And that's the point I feel like this book really is trying to make, is it's not about whose was more inhumane. It's about the fact that all people could have found themselves on a slave ship, a slave plantation, until death. Because becoming a prisoner of war was very easy in those times. L. Ruach Ahmes, in The Source of Racial Thought in Colonial America, states that the slave trade worked in both directions, with white merchandise as well as black. And that source is the Journal of Negro History. In 1659, the English Parliament debated the practice of selling British whites into slavery in the New World. In the debate, the whites were referred to not as indentured servants, but as slaves, whose enslavement threatened the liberties of all Englishmen. This was said by Thomas Burton in the Parliamentary Diaries of 1656 to 59, Volume 4. Foster R. Dulles in Labor in America quotes an early document describing white children in colonial servitude as crying and mourning for redemption from their slavery. Dr. Hilary McD. Beckles of the University of Hull, England, writes regarding white slave labor: indentured contracts were alienable, the ownership of which could easily be transferred. Like that of any other commodity, as with slaves, ownership changed without their participation in the dialogue concerning transfer. Beckles refers to indentured servitude as white proto-slavery. And this is in the book The Americas. In the Calendar of State Papers Colonial Series, America and West Indies of 1701, we read of a protest over the encouragement of the spiriting away of Englishmen without their consent and selling them for slaves, which hath been a practice very frequent and known by the name of kidnapping. emphasis added. And the nabbing. In the British West Indies, plantation slavery was instituted as early as 1627. In Barbados, by the 1640s, there were an estimated 25,000 slaves, of whom 21,700 were white. Some observations of the island of Barbados. Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, page 528 reads, "It is worth noting that while white slaves were worked to death in Barbados, there were Caribbean Indians brought from Guyana to help propagate native foodstuffs, who were well treated and received as free persons by the wealthy planters." And this is definitely a topic that we all need to understand, is even when enslavement was happening in certain regions, that doesn't mean that the entire state or the entire region or the entire island was under slavery. Slavery was a business, it was a industry, and there were people, as it's saying here, natives of Guyana, who had resources. I'm pretty sure they had defense, they had weapons, and they were well treated and received as free persons. So there were free men, there were free women during a time, and during the time of enslavement, just like there were people, free Moors, during enslavement times. Status was always a thing. And it says, of the fact that the wealth of Barbados was founded on the backs of white slave labor, there can be no doubt. White slave laborers from Britain and Ireland were the mainstay of the sugar colony. Until the mid-1640s, there were few blacks in Barbados. George Downing wrote to John Winthrop, the colonial governor of Massachusetts, in 1645, that planters who wanted to make a fortune in the British West Indies must procure white slave labor out of England if they wanted to succeed. Elizabeth Donna, in the book Documents Illustrative of the History of the Slave Trade to America. White indentured servants were employed and treated incidentally exactly like slaves, says Morley Ayerst in the book The British West Indies, page 19. The many gradations of unfreedom among whites made it difficult to draw fast lines between any idealized free white worker and a pitied or scorned servile black worker. In labor short 17th and 18th century America, the work of slaves and that of white servants were virtually interchangeable in most areas. And that was said by David Roediger in The Wages of Whiteness, Race, and the Making of the American Working Class. In the Massachusetts Court of Assistants, whose records date to 1633, we find a 1638 description of a white man, one Giles Player, as having been delivered up for a slave. The Englishman William Eddies, after observing white slaves in America in the 1770s, wrote generally, "They groan beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage." Letters from America, London, 1792. The Governor Sharp of the Maryland colony compared the property interests of the planters and their white slaves with the estate an English farmer consisting of a multitude of cattle. The Quock Walker case in Massachusetts in 1783, which ruled that slavery was contrary to the state constitution, was applied equally to blacks and whites in Massachusetts. Patrick F. Moran, in his historical sketch of the persecutions suffered by the Catholics of Ireland, refers to the transportation of the Irish to the colonies as the slave trade. The disciplinary and revenue laws of early Virginia, 1631 to 1645, did not discriminate Negroes in bondage from whites in bondage. And this is from William Henning, Statutes at Large of Virginia, Volume 1. For records of wills in which land, goods, and chattel, cattle, monies, Negroes, English servants, horses, sheep, and household stuff were all sold together, see the Lancaster County records in Virginia, Colonial Abstract. So this is just giving a lot of sources from states that no person can, you can't deny this. This is state records. This is colonial documented fact that Europeans, whites, were in bondage and enslaved at the same time a Negro would be. And that's something that we need to come to grips with historically. So I'm not going to read all of this because there's so much in this book. I wanted to go down to another page that I wanted to finish this off at. Actually, one thing I didn't do in the beginning, I didn't go through the table of contents of this book. Thought it was hard to find it. Excuse me. I'm not seeing the table of contents, but I'll read it. I have the physical copy here, so give me 1 second. So just to read some of the contents of this book, and if you'd like to get this book, please reach out to us. Email me directly. Leave your email in the chat if you'd like a copy. PDF. Some of the contents of this book is a lot we went over. White slavery in early America, the Holocaust against the white poor, the political economy of the Industrial Revolution, the factory system, human brooms, breaking the chains of illusion. And that human brooms one, they romanticize a chimney sweep with Mary Poppins. But I don't think any person would want their mother being a chimney sweep. There are many other respectable jobs. Other chapters are poor whites in the Southern Confederacy. Whites were the first slaves in America. Irish slaves. Protestant slaves. Legal bias and definition. white political prisoners sold into slavery, slave hunting in Britain, white children in chains, the white losses in the Middle Passage, whites treated worse than blacks, indentures and an organized racket, enslavement of the white family, when hell was in session, fugitive slave law, escaping whites hunted and tortured, white slaves in the American Revolution, white slave rebellions, torture and murder of white slaves. And the last chapter is crackers, red legs, rednecks, and hillbillies. So once again, I thank you all for listening and tapping in. This is a great book, and we have many source books on this topic, not just this one. I wanted to show a few of them quickly before I go. 1 second. Again, this is the book They Were White and They Were Slaves. If you would like it, email me, DM me. Check out mypdfbooks.com. We also have other books on this topic as White Slaves, African Masters, an anthology of American Barbary captivity and narratives. This was the Barbary Wars, where the Moors enslaved Europeans who were traveling through their waters without giving tariff, without giving payment, just like we pass tolls right now in today's world. Well, the Mediterranean and the Straits of Gibraltar was a toll that North Africans had control over. And Europeans would face captivity if they didn't pay. And lastly, I just want to show this image. This is a sculpture in Annapolis, Maryland, one of the oldest naval statues, which is a monument to the Moors of Tripoli, the Barbary pirates. Because before the invention of the gun, these were the brothers who definitely shaped this world. They definitely had a stronghold on society and culture. And we just want you all to understand how tables have turned, how our ancestors were on top for a very long time, and it was inevitable that we would fall and we would go through enslavement. And that's not the last chapter of our story, nor is it the most important or the most influential. It may have done so much damage to us as a people to displace us from the rhythm of our culture. And it's up to us at this point to Sankofa, to go back, reach back, relearn. There's nothing wrong with relearning your culture. That's what we do here at the Burning Bush Tabernacle. We know we're Moors. We are not sovereign citizens. We know historically and who our heritage is, where our bloodlines come from, without DNA tests, without relying only on a blood test. We know through oral tradition and historical records that we are of the bloodline of Moorish peoples, with no doubt or contradiction. With all that being said, I thank you all for listening and tapping in. I'm your host, Noble Moso L. Again, check us out at mypdfbooks.com for any books or literature. If you would like any herbal teas to go with your books, tap in with me as well. Gratitude, peace, love, and light for all listeners. Islam.
mypdfbooks.com. That's books with a Z.